we're talking about a withdrawal from the besieged town of Severodonetsk in Lugansk region, a town whose position was becoming increasingly untenable. There were suggestions that they should withdraw to the neighboring town of Lysychansk, which is said to be more defendable, and there were even some suggestions that the entire salient, the troops in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, should be withdrawn entirely. Well, a week later, we got news that the Russians were in control of most of Severodonetsk. The Ukrainian troops seemed to have fled from the eastern and central areas, and that they'd pulled back to the industrial zone, in effect to the Azot chemical factory. And then yesterday, we got further reports that instead of pulling back, as many people had been expecting that they would do, and as some Ukrainian officials have advised, instead of pulling back, the Ukrainian military in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk has instead attempted a counterattack in Severodonetsk. Now, this seems, on the face of it, extremely strange, and we had a report from Reuters about this. The attack, which was presumably intended to be timed with the 100th anniversary of the war, was supposed to show recapture of large amounts of Severodonetsk by the Ukrainian forces, presumably strengthening the impression that Ukraine has the Russians on the run in this area. And Reuters was clearly invited to send its reporters to Severodonetsk. And some was trying to get there from the Donbass side using vehicles provided by the militia, except that those vehicles appear to have been targeted and hit by, I presume, Ukrainian shells, so that some of the people who were accompanying the Reuters journalists were killed, and the Reuters journalists themselves were injured. And then there was a further attempt to send in journalists, Reuters journalists, from the other side of the battlefield, from the Ukrainian side. And the Reuters dispatch speaks of these of the vehicles speeding across a motorway, a road littered with burnt-out armoured vehicles. It doesn't say whose armoured vehicles, by the way, and of a wounded Ukrainian soldier in the back of the car. And sure enough, the Reuters journalists did find their way to Severodonetsk and did report that there were Ukrainian troops still fighting there, but the report doesn't say in what part of Severodonetsk or how much of the town Ukraine actually controls, but it does seem indeed that the fighting is extremely fierce. Now, from the Russian side, the reports are that this was an attempt by Ukraine to enlarge, to regain control of some of the residential areas close to the Azot factory. And the Russians also say that large numbers of foreign volunteers were involved on the Ukrainian side in this counterattack. And this seems to be in part corroborated by the Reuters dispatch, because it's interesting that the only Ukrainian soldier that Reuters appears to have interviewed in this fighting was not a Ukrainian at all, but an ethnic Georgian, a Georgian volunteer who spoke bravely about fighting on until victory, even if that takes a whole year. So it seems that the Ukrainians, instead of trying to pull back from Severodonetsk, are intent on putting up a fight. They're throwing away more men into this battle, and the latest reports is that the remaining bridges between linking Severodonetsk to Lysychansk across the Seversky Donets River are being shelled and destroyed by the Russians, which suggests that the Russian plan is to trap these troops who are counterattacking in Severodonetsk. And I've been hearing also that the reports are coming through that there's massive Russian artillery fire on these counterattacking Ukrainian troops, and that the Russians are probing other areas around Lysychansk to try to encircle Lysychansk. And there's also reports that the Russians are pressing forward in other parts of the northern Donbass. They're increasingly approaching Bakhmut, the main center, rear base of the Ukrainians in this part of Donbass, and also that they've now largely gained control of a town called Svyatogorsk, though there is still fighting going on with Ukrainian troops now stationed in the Svyatogorsk monastery, which is, by the way, an important center of Russian Orthodoxy. So a battle still going on in Donbass, heavy losses, Ukrainians launching what looks like a hopeless counterattack, reinforcing failure. I'm not a military person, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps the Ukrainians will be able to recapture Severodonetsk, but it doesn't seem to me at all likely. And some of you who've been following my programs will remember that just a few days ago, perhaps I think it was the day before yesterday, I read out a statement, a discussion about the battle in Severodonetsk from a Russian blogger who clearly has some kind of military understanding of the war. And this person was saying that capturing Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, though that might be good for Russian morale, it would not ultimately be what the Russians are wanting to achieve. Their priority is to encircle and destroy the Ukrainian troops in these two towns, Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And if the Ukrainians instead manage to withdraw these troops in good order to their own battle lines, that would actually be a kind of defeat for Russia. Well, if that analysis is correct, this particular Russian blogger must feel that the Ukrainian counterattack in Severodonetsk is playing directly into Russian hands, or so it seems to me. Well, that seems to me the situation. President Zelensky has now admitted that a fifth of Ukrainian territory is now under Russian control. I'm not a statistician. I'm not able to measure area. I gather that means a fifth of territory minus Crimea. So it would be a fifth of the territory that that Ukraine has controlled or has nominally controlled since 2014, when it lost Crimea. And that compares with the situation at the start of the war, when the Russian-backed forces in Donbass, the militia in Donbass, controlled 7% of Ukrainian territory. So it's trebled. And Ukraine is holding the Russians back, or trying to, at the cost of enormous losses. And President Zelensky now admits that Ukraine is losing 600 men, 100 dead, 500 wounded every day in the battles in Donbass. I saw a report, I think it was in CNN, which admitted that Ukrainian losses may be at least double that figure. Others put it, of course, higher still. The Russian Ministry of Defense put it much higher. I mean, I'm not going to guess, but there's no doubt at all that Ukraine is paying a terrible loss for continuing to fight in this kind of way. And there's been all sorts of discussions about supplying Ukraine with arms, a flood of Western arms, all supposedly to prepare Ukraine for a great counteroffensive that's going to be launched later in the summer to try and recapture territory. Well, we've seen that Ukraine did try and launch a counteroffensive in Kharkiv, and that has gone into reverse. The Kherson counteroffensive, so far as I can see, is going nowhere. There's little sign that Ukraine is actually building up forces that I can see in central and in western Ukraine. On the contrary, what appears to be happening is that the Ukrainians are trying to hold the line in Donbass, continuing to feed troops into Donbass, continuing to experience more and more mounting losses in Donbass, even as they continue to try to fight to retain this territory, which, to be clear, doesn't want to be a part of them. Anyway, that's the Ukrainian strategy. I suspect now that the clock is ticking and that even its Western backers, Ukraine's most fervid Western backers, are starting to have doubts. Now, a couple of days ago, there was a very interesting op-ed by President Biden in the New York Times, and I've discussed it in previous programs, and I said that it was striking how much more measured the language was than in previous language that President Biden has used, and that it did seem to set a limit on the amount of support that the United States is prepared to give to Ukraine. And we've now received further reports that the Pentagon is beginning to become increasingly concerned that the more support is provided to Ukraine and the more the war is drawn out, the more depleted American arsenals become, and that it's becoming more and more difficult and more costly and more dangerous for the United States to supply weapon systems to Ukraine. And we've seen that Germany, for example, has all but given up trying to supply weapon systems to Ukraine. There's been talk about supplying Leopard tanks, but that hasn't happened. There's been some talk of supplying Marder armored vehicles to Ukraine, but that hasn't happened. Also, Chancellor Scholz talked about providing Ukraine with a missile system, except that he was immediately contradicted by the German military, who said that they don't actually have any examples of this system. It would need to be made before it could be provided. And it seems that there is now some resistance from West European militaries to providing multiple launch rocket systems to Ukraine to supplement those 4 items that the United States itself is providing, because again, doing so would start to both potentially undermine Western stocks, West European stocks of these systems, but it would also potentially aggravate or prolong, or perhaps perish the thought, expand the war. So there's been some concern about the issue of military supplies, and that seems to be slowing down. But there is also, I suspect, a further change, a sea change. Firstly, there is increasing concern that Ukraine will lose, and of course if it does lose, that would be a political catastrophe for the Western leaders who have so heavily invested the West's prestige in the war in Ukraine. And there's been an article in The Hill, which is one of those news magazines, media magazines widely read in the United States amongst the political class there, and it speaks about the unpalatable reality that Russia is likely to achieve victory in Ukraine. And that's something which the author of this article says that the United States needs to start preparing for. I would have thought this administration would, for many reasons, want to avoid finding itself in that kind of situation where the Russians have achieved a clear-cut victory in Ukraine. But there is also, obviously, the long-term effects of the sanctions, which are now starting to weigh on the Western economies themselves. And in a previous video, I talked about the article in The Guardian by the economics editor of The Guardian, Larry Elliott, about how Russia is winning the economic war. And in fact, what we've seen is that the sanctions have deprived the West of direct access to Russian oil. Interestingly, there is now admissions that the West can in fact continue to import Russian oil through middlemen. So presumably they are now actually looking to buy Russian oil at a higher price from India. But this now seems to be, and I'm taking this from, this is my understanding of what's been said in an article in Der Spiegel, which is of course a German newspaper, that there seems to be an admission that this can happen and that it wouldn't directly breach the sanctions. So we'll continue to import Russian oil, only we won't call it Russian oil anymore, and we'll import it after it's been laundered for us by third parties at an admittedly higher price. That all seems to me extremely complicated and an extremely strange way of going about things. But anyway, the Der Spiegel article seemed to accept that there would be a price for the West to pay in oil as a result of the oil import ban, but that the Russians would have now the time and the space and of course the motivation to reroute their oil exports to alternative suppliers, and they're not having very much difficulty in doing so. And there's been apparently some comments from the Indian foreign minister, and apparently he was pressured by some people about India buying Russian oil, and he made some rather tart points. He said that apparently said that the Europeans have a habit of making their problems, or wanting to make their problems, the world's problems, and disregarding the world's problems if they don't affect Europe. In other words, he was saying that the Europeans continue to have an incredibly Eurocentric vision of the world. They seem to imagine that a conflict in Europe is the single most important event in the world, and the rest of the world clearly doesn't think so. And that was, or so it seemed to me, essentially the Indian foreign minister saying that India doesn't anyway indeed intend to step up its purchases of Russian oil, and is presumably looking to enter into a long-term relationship as an energy importer with Russia. And of course, China is also stepping up its imports of oil and other products from Russia, and there are of course already projects to build gas pipelines to China, which are already underway. So whole situation on that front has begun to shift. And as I discussed in my previous program, the chairman of the African Union, the president of Senegal, has been in Russia. He's had a meeting with President Putin of Russia. They've talked about how the Russians can help Africa with wheat and food imports. And it was quite interesting to see that the president of Senegal also appeared to blame the sanctions, the EU's and the West's sanctions, for Africa's food difficulties. And all of this is leading some European leaders, admittedly, they're very much on the margins. Silvio Berlusconi is the most important, but Silvio Berlusconi, who's a marginal player in Italian politics today, but he still does support the Italian government, the Italian coalition. He's a member of the current Italian coalition. He says that far from the West having isolated Russia, it is the West that's been isolated on this conflict from the rest of the world. So all of this is now, I think, beginning to press in and weigh in. And we're starting to see growing signs of electoral trouble. Now, the Estonian government, one of the most passionately anti-Russian governments in Europe, has now collapsed. The coalition has collapsed. The Estonian Prime Minister has blamed one of her coalition partners for being sympathetic to Russia. It's very interesting to see how Western coverage of this government crisis in Estonia is not being linked to the surging inflation crisis in Estonia, where inflation is now at around 22%. In other words, Estonians are taking a massive hit in their living standards, and despite the fact that this government crisis is being explained in other ways, I can't personally help but believe that it is partly this collapse in living standards, this inflation crisis in Estonia, which is ultimately the explanation and the cause for the government crisis which has taken place there. So that's Estonia. Now we're getting reports that once again President Macron is starting to worry about the prospects of his electoral prospects. He managed to get re-elected in France in the presidential elections. His majority fell, but he's still the president of France. He's been rather quiet recently, and apparently he's starting to worry that the pro-government parties that support him might lose their majority in the French legislative elections, which are coming. And the concern is that both Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party and perhaps more seriously Jean-Luc Mélenchon's left-wing coalition are beginning to make significant inroads, and that between them the left and the right might gain a majority over the centre. Now, I'm not certain that this is the case. I'm not even sure what it would mean. I suspect that in such a situation we would see a long haggle and probably negotiations between the centrist parties and the central bloc that supports Macron and Jean-Luc Mélenchon to try to form some kind of centre-left coalition. That's my guess. So it might not mean very much, but certainly it does seem as if Macron and his bloc are at the moment under some degree of electoral pressure. And of course in Britain, we are now getting a major governmental crisis. The media here has largely stopped talking about Ukraine. We're talking instead about the fall in living standards. There is a concerted move by some people in the Conservative Party to remove Boris Johnson from the premiership, though it's completely unclear at the moment who his replacement might be. And besides, the whole story has been submerged in the celebrations that have been taking place in Britain of the Queen's Jubilee, the anniversary of her accession as monarch, which took place 70 years ago. So a governmental crisis escalating in Britain, and of course we also see fracturing problems in the United States, where the Democrats are worrying about major losses to the Republicans in the midterms, and where the Republican leadership in Congress may be starting to worry that the Trump wing of the Republican Party is starting to make inroads and is starting to win an uncomfortably large number of Republican primaries, and where opinion generally amongst Americans seems to be turning against further support for Ukraine. Last but not least, there's Germany. And here also one senses that the mood is starting to sour on support for Ukraine as the economic problems mount. And again, there's talk that the coalition government cobbled together by Olaf Scholz after the election last year, that too is beginning to fracture. And I'm now starting finally to read reports that the days of this particular government may be numbered. Though again, what kind of government would take over, it's difficult to try to guess. Anyway, the long and the short of all of this is that perhaps unsurprisingly, there are now rumours, and at the moment they are only rumours, that the United States, Britain, and the EU are now in discussions with each other about a possible way out of this war, that they're looking for an off-ramp. And we've talked about this in earlier programs. We discussed this in our discussions on the Duran, including our most recent live stream with Jacob Dreisen of the Dreisen Report, that they're now starting to try and search for an off-ramp. And there appear to be discussions about an Italian idea, a peace proposal, which would seek some kind of a ceasefire, which would look for some kind of negotiated settlement to the Ukrainian conflict, and which would then offer the Russians, this being the bait that's being used to win over the Russians, some kind of negotiation towards disarmament and some kind of security arrangements for Europe. It's all very much like some of the ideas that Emmanuel Macron was floating just before the war started, and which didn't seem to get much traction in the West at that time, and which I have to say the Russians were completely unimpressed by. But Macron, perhaps using his Italian friends as the people to put these ideas forward, he seems to be trying to revive these ideas, and he's now come out with a statement that even though Russia made a mistake by starting the war, it is important not to humiliate Russia, and that's why we need to have peace, which is an odd way of saying that we need to have peace because things are not going particularly well for ourselves. Also, it seems to me. Anyway, the trouble is, these proposals that are being floated around are not of a sort that I think the Russians would accept. Firstly, they still seem to find it very difficult to acknowledge the reality, the political reality, that Crimea is now part of Russia. Apparently doing that is something that the Western governments find impossible to concede politically. And of course, inevitably, the status of Donbass itself is now up for, they're not prepared, it seems, to discuss this. Apparently, the one thing that they're now edging towards is accepting that Ukraine will be neutral, must be neutral in future. Now, of course, if they'd accepted that before the war, in all those prolonged discussions and negotiations which were taking place in December and January, well, probably no war would have happened. They are now, however, coming round to that. They seem to think that if they accept this now, the Russians will somehow end the war on that basis. I don't think that the Russians are interested. What all of these discussions, however, will do is, I suspect, they're going to unnerve the Ukrainians. Now, according to CNN, which is our major source for information about these tentative discussions that the Western powers are holding with each other, according to CNN, Ukraine itself is not participating in these discussions. Now, that doesn't surprise me because so far the Ukrainians themselves have shown little interest in negotiating with Russia. They've stopped negotiating since the debacle of Istanbul. Now, in Istanbul, Ukraine did make major moves towards meeting the Russian demands. They accepted that Ukraine would be a neutral state. They accepted that the security guarantees that they would be looking for to cover Ukraine, to ensure Ukraine's protection, would come from a group of guarantor states, including Russia itself, but that they would not extend to Crimea and Donbass, appearing to take a first step to recognizing that Crimea and Donbass would leave Ukraine. And they seemed to be prepared to make further concessions about deployment of foreign troops in Ukraine, about conducting exercises with foreign troops in Ukraine. They appeared to accept that that the Russians would have an effective veto over these foreign troop deployments in Ukraine itself. It was far from being a complete surrender to the Russians, or even a step towards meeting all Russian demands. But it was a significant step in that direction, and the Russians did treat it as such. Well, the Ukrainians pulled back from that. They claimed that the reason was the discovery of the atrocities that had allegedly been carried out by the Russians in a particular town north of Kiev. By the way, you may have noticed that we're hearing a lot less about that over the recent days, but never mind. But the real reason is that they were talked out of these negotiations by the Americans and the British. Boris Johnson telephoned Zelensky and told him that negotiations that made territorial concessions to the Russians, even with respect to Crimea, was simply not acceptable. And apparently he visited Kiev and repeated this to Zelensky in person. And there are reports that he apparently told Zelensky, and in this he was backed by the United States, that if Ukraine were to make such concessions, then Ukraine would not obtain from the Americans and the British the kind of security guarantees that it was looking for. So on that basis, Zelensky dropped the demands, the concessions, reversed the concessions made in Istanbul. The talks ever since have been in deadlock, and the result is that we have seen no real progress in the talks ever since then. And on the contrary, the result has been that the war has intensified and Ukraine has been losing hundreds of men every day in the Donbass, even as President Zelensky has admitted, and has now lost around a fifth of its territory. And with the Russians now taking steps to incorporate Kherson region and Zaporozhye region together with Donbass in the territories that they say that must be separated from Ukraine. So that's where we are. The Ukrainians have lost hundreds of men, thousands of men, and have seen the Russians lay claim to more territory because the Ukrainians were persuaded by the Western powers not to proceed with the process that seemed to be underway in Istanbul. So understandably, the Ukrainians, who were led to think, or seem to have been led to think, that the West would supply them with vast amounts of weapon systems which would allow them to go onto the offensive and drive the Russians out of the whole of Ukraine, and that they would be able to regain Crimea. At least that's what the Ukrainians were saying. The Ukrainians are not happy, would not be happy with these discussions, and that the Europeans, that the Western powers appear to be having amongst themselves, and they will be extremely unhappy if they are formally told about them. I should have worked out or guessed that these discussions were probably taking place within the Western powers, and that there is an important clue that these discussions are taking place amongst the Western powers, because importantly, President Biden's op-ed in the New York Times appears to have, in effect, conceded that such discussions are likely to be underway. And I say that because he makes these points in his op-eds. He says, "My principle throughout this crisis has been nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. I will not pressure the Ukrainian government, in private or public, to make any territorial concessions. It would be wrong and contrary to well-settled principles to do so. Ukraine's talks with Russia are not stalled because Ukraine has turned its back on diplomacy. They are stalled because Russia continues to wage a war to take control of as much of Ukraine as it can. Now, those words that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, I think, can almost be taken as confirmation. I'm sorry if I'm going to sound very cynical now, but can almost be taken as as confirmation that secret talks about Ukraine are indeed taking place behind Ukraine's back. These words are clearly intended to reassure the Ukrainians, who must have got wind that these talks amongst the Western powers are actually happening. But note that whilst he says that he will not pressure the Ukrainian government, in private or public, to make any territorial concessions, he's not ruling out the possibility that territorial concessions might have to be made. And he also says that Ukraine's talks with Russia are not stalled because Ukraine has turned its back on diplomacy, when of course he knows perfectly well that that's precisely what, for the moment, on Western urging, Ukraine has actually done. So if you read these words in the op-ed carefully, you can see that there is indeed something going on amongst the Western powers, that they're trying to find some way to end the war, and they aren't involving Ukraine, probably almost certainly because they understand that some form of territorial concessions to the Russians are going to be the inevitable consequences of any negotiation process. Now, as I've said already, I can't imagine that the Russians will show much interest in any of this. As far as they're concerned, they've seen off the sanctions war. Their economy is stabilizing and it will grow. People who think that they're running around, the Russians are running around seizing washing machines to prize out microchips, are living in fairyland, to say this quite frankly. Der Spiegel and Reuters both accept that the oil ban on Russia is not going to collapse Russia's economy, and Der Spiegel seems to say that the Europeans will be ending up buying Russian oil from third parties, even if it will no longer be called that, something which I've been saying is going to happen all the time. So the sanctions war has in effect run its course. It looks like it's failed. It looks like there's an acknowledgement that it's failed. It looks like at Larry Elliott's piece in The Guardian that there will have to be a deal done, that's turning out to be true. Western governments starting to understand the failure of the sanctions. They're beginning to pay a political price. They're looking for a way out. So we have these discussions. The Russians feel under no pressure in the economic front, and on the military front, they're winning the war. And they're looking at all these weapon systems that the West is providing Ukraine. And I think that these weapon systems are having the opposite effect of what the Western powers appear to think, because they're not sufficient to enable Ukraine to mount counteroffensives. They're not sufficient for Ukraine to defeat the Russian army. They're not, in my opinion, even sufficient or anywhere close to being sufficient for Ukraine to mount a successful defense. And I've been reading and watching programs program, for example, some very interesting programs, discussions about these weapon systems from someone who calls himself the New Atlas, and also, of course, from Jacob Dreisen, who I follow meticulously, pointing out that these weapon systems are very difficult for Ukraine to use, that absorbing and learning how to use these weapon systems would take Ukraine far too long for Ukraine to be able to use them effectively, certainly not before the end of the summer. So the Russians, of course, must know this. They're winning the war. Obviously, they're taking losses. But, as I said, they probably feel that, in a way, these weapon systems are working to their advantage. Because, on the one hand, they're providing Ukraine with weapon systems which are not going to turn the tables in the war. But on the other hand, they're hardening Russian morale. Now, I'm starting to get reports that the mood amongst Russian soldiers in Donbass has actually hardened, that they're hearing about these Western weapon systems that are being deployed against them, and they're now saying to each other that they're no longer fighting Ukraine, they are fighting NATO. That President Putin's comments at the start of the war, that this is a war to defend Russia from NATO, that's beginning to gain traction, and the presence of these NATO weapon systems is increasingly making Russian soldiers see it in those terms. And that's stiffening morale, as it would do in conditions where it is the Russians who are advancing and on the offensive, and the Ukrainians who are retreating. So given all of these factors, economic, diplomatic, psychological, why should the Russians at the moment give the West the kind of face-saving off-ramp that the Western powers seem to be searching for? Would it not make more sense for the Russians to continue the war until there is some kind of military collapse in Ukraine and dictate terms to Ukraine and also by extension to the West, so that this problem of Ukraine, this festering problem, is resolved once and for all, and so that the Western powers understand once and for all that they can't and that they mustn't challenge Mother Russia? That seems to me the logic. But if that's the position on the Russian side, just imagine what the response will be on the Ukrainian side, if and when the fact that the Western powers are coming up with all these discussions, and if and when the Western powers start telling the Ukrainians that they must sit down and negotiate with the Russians, contradicting all the things the Ukrainians were told back in March, what the effect of that is going to be on the Ukrainians, including those Ukrainian soldiers who are fighting on the front lines and their families, and of course the families of all those Ukrainian soldiers who have died and who have been injured. They are being told that they should continue fighting because all these Western weapon systems are going to come to their rescue and are going to change the direction of the battle and will enable Ukraine to mount this great counter-offensive and achieve victory. And instead, what they're going to discover is that behind Ukraine's back, the Western powers, far from being 100% behind Ukraine, are on the contrary looking for ways to disengage from the war. A lot of people in Ukraine are going to be very bitter and very angry. Some are going to feel deeply betrayed. Others will say to themselves, what was all that for? And I suspect there will even be some people in the political class in Kiev who will say to each other, well, why did the Western powers tell us to back out of the negotiations in March when they're now telling us, in effect, to negotiate with the Russians in June? So that's, it seems to me, where we are. A situation where Ukraine continues to commit resources to defending undefendable positions, experiencing massive losses. I suspect that they're probably doing that because they sense that Western support for them is weakening, and they feel, therefore, under some kind of moral pressure to keep fighting every inch of territory, because that's the only way that they can persuade the Western powers that the defense of Ukraine is worth sustaining. So that's what the Ukrainians are doing. The Western powers, in the meantime, increasingly disillusioned by the course of the war, talking with each other, trying to find an off-ramp with each other, perhaps struggling to do so, and maneuvering themselves into a position where it could very well turn out that they are going to take steps which in Ukraine could be seen as a betrayal. Well, I think that in these sort of situations, in these kind of circumstances, if what we're hearing, and I've stressed at the moment these are only rumours, but they are rumours that seem to be fairly well authenticated. If there are these discussions going on amongst the Western powers, the best thing to do is to be open about the fact, to be open to the Ukrainians, that there are now limits to Western aid, that in fact those limits have now been reached, that Ukraine is not going to be supported to the point of victory, that the Western powers have failed in their objective of trying to smash Russia economically, that Ukraine is losing the war in Donbass, and it is time for Ukraine to return to the Istanbul process, accepting and understanding that more concessions will have to be made than Ukraine was prepared to make in Istanbul. Now, that's going to be a bitter pill for Ukraine to swallow, but if one is straightforward about this, it's possible that the Russians might be persuaded to return to the Istanbul process. It might be possible to get Ukraine to return to the Istanbul process, and then we might get peace. The Russians, as I said, might be very difficult to talk round. But what better solution is there? Would it not be better, in fact, for Ukraine simply to announce a unilateral pullback from Donbass and announce a unilateral ceasefire? I suspect the Russians would be under heavy pressure at that point to accept it. Then we could have negotiations. There might be a Ukrainian acceptance that they would have to give up not just Donbass, but a much more extensive belt of their territory. They might be forced into concessions about the status of Russian speakers within Ukraine. There might also be acceptance that about the status of Odessa. I know a lot of people in videos we've done on the Duran have been talking about this, but at least the war would have ended and there would be some Ukraine left. That might be the way forward. It certainly seems to me a more practical and realistic way forward than these discussions that are taking place in private within the West. And it was certainly far more practical and indeed humane than continuing the war in the way that Ukraine is doing. There is a danger that, just as happened in Afghanistan, where the war was prolonged beyond all reason as an exercise in saving face, in saving the face of American generals in that case, and American politicians, so there is a danger that the war in Ukraine is going to be prolonged unreasonably and absurdly for the same reason, to save the face of Western leaders and of the collective West in general. Well, Afghanistan showed the folly of doing that. As before, did Vietnam, South Vietnam. Let's hope and pray that this time it's different. Though I have to say, I hardly think so. Anyway, that's enough for me today. More from me soon. In the meantime, please remember that you can check us out on other platforms, this channel and the Duran channel as well, and Alex Christoforou on other platforms, Rumble and Locals. And you can join us on Locals by going to if you're watching us on Rumble, by going to the top of the video and pressing the red maroon button. That will take you directly to Locals, where you will find heaps of exclusive content from me, from Alex Christoforou, and by the way, also from other members of the Duran community, which you can join on Locals. And of course, we're also present on other platforms, SuperU, Odyssey, and the others. We have a very strong Telegram channel now. And of course, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And also you can go to our shop, buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hoodies, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. Well, that's enough for me today. Please remember to tick the like button if you like this video. Please remember to check your subscription to this channel, and more from me soon, and have a very good day until we speak again.